Hi, peeps. You're listening to She's My Cherry Pie, the baking podcast from the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessie Sheehan. I'm a baker, recipe developer, and author of 4 baking books, including Snackable Bakes. In each episode, I hang out with some of the sweetest bakers around and take a deep dive into their signature bakes. Today's guest is Julie McAllister. Julie is a Charleston-based cake artist known for her hyper-realistic cakes. She creates intricate works of art, transforming cake layers, fondant, and modeling chocolate into lifelike designs. Julie also hosts cake artistry workshops and online tutorials. Her work has appeared in magazines, including HGTV magazine, and her clients range from Reese Witherspoon to Garden & Gun. She was also a contestant on Season 3 of the Netflix show Is It Cake? And on Season 4 of Holiday Wars on Food Network. Julie joins me to talk about her baking journey and how she got into cake making. Spoiler alert, it began with a yellow cake from a box. About her first and only bakery job where she worked from 4 a.m. to 9 a.m. before going to her day job in advertising. And about how she taught herself to decorate cakes by reading books, as there was no YouTube yet. She also walks me through 2 birthday purse cakes she made for Reese Witherspoon, her citrus topiary cake, and her oyster cakes, which are not only the cakes she makes for grooms, but also the subject of her most popular classes. I loved chatting with Julie, so stay tuned for our convo. Today is Jubilee Day. I'm looking forward to connecting with the Bomb Squad at Cherry Bomb's annual conference happening today at the Glass House in Manhattan. Tickets are sold out, but if you snagged one, I will see you there. You can find me at the Fresh Out of the Oven breakout session where I'll be moderating a panel featuring Lucy Franteferriere of From Lucy, Zoe Canan of Elbow Bread, Shopa Yuskokovich of Honey's Bakery, and Connie McDonald and Pam Weeks of Levan Bakery. I can't wait to hear what they have to say about running a busy bakery in the city and what it's like developing some of the city's favorite baked goods. Do come say hi to me if you see me today, and Happy Jubilee Day. Let's chat with today's guest. Julie, so excited to have you on She's My Cherry Pie and to chat hyper-realistic cakes with you and so much more.
Thank you so much, Jessie. I'm so excited to be here with you.
You have had, as you describe it, a lifelong sweet tooth. Can you tell us about an early sweet eating memory that stands out in your mind?
I think there's kind of the overarching, dessert was always there. We never wanted for dessert. And then when the holidays would roll around, that was kind of when my mom would kick it into another gear. There were a few cookie recipes that were from her mom that her and all of her sisters would bake. And there's the treasured recipe box that I actually secretly have. I don't think anyone knows that I have confiscated it. And I treasure those cookie recipes so much. But I just, the holidays, it's such a specific, you have the family tie, the emotional tie. That's definitely the one that stands out for the most for me. Just all joy.
Yeah.
Every single baked good memory is just wrapped up in joy.
What about a really early baking memory? You actually in the kitchen baking something, or maybe baking with your mom or...
My mom, loved to bake, loved dessert, but she definitely, so the cookies were kind of in a league of their own for Christmas. But other than that, it was a lot of cake mix baking and, brownie mix baking, which I love. No shame against this. But I think I was in, middle school, high school, the first time she kind of let me do one of those cake mixes on my own. I can look at it now and say it's kind of foolproof. You just put 2 things together and then it magically makes a cake or cupcakes. But at the time, it was such the sense of pride and accomplishment. And I definitely think that kind of lit the fire of, oh, I want this to be the thing that I do in my free time now.
You've described yourself as sort of being a hobby baker throughout your life. Would you say that hobby baking sort of began around then, around those teenage years when your mom allowed you to make a cake, or was it even earlier? Were you helping with the Christmas cookies each year?
I would say when it became my defined hobby was definitely in high school. I can remember coming home with a friend and every single day for a period of time, I would make her come home with me just so we could make a Duncan Hines yellow cake mix and just try it in different ways. We would do cupcakes one day, cake pans the next day, and occasionally we would throw a brownie mix in there too. But I just loved the act of baking. And
Yeah.
I mean, and using a mix, that's like in its simplest form.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until I got to college and I started being like, oh my gosh, there are recipes out there and you could try all these things. But it was definitely high school. And that was like, okay, this is my hobby. This is what I do in my free time.
Yeah, I read about that, you and your pal. You had said yellow cake. I wondered if you guys ever branched out to a different flavor. And I also wondered, did you put any frosting on it?
So the yellow cake always had chocolate frosting. You know, occasionally dabble in a devil's food cake mix as well. That we probably did either chocolate or vanilla frosting. Once I got to college and I started experimenting with other recipes and baking things from scratch, that's when I really started to, like, I remember making a lemon cake for the first time, and it's very similar to a vanilla cake batter, but you're adding, you know, zest and juice. And I thought I was just the fanciest baker in the world. I was like, oh my gosh, look at me. I'm really kicking it up a notch. It's just the best. And I love how with baking, there's never an end. Like there's always a new avenue that you can create. Like if you get tired of baking cakes in your free time, like you can switch to pastry, you can switch to pies. Even if you only ever made pies, there are 1,000 different ways to make a single pie flavor. I love it. It's like this never ending resource that will always be there to provide fun in my free time.
You kind of already mentioned them, but I read about those recipe cards, your family recipe cards. I wondered, are they the kinds of things that you love to look at just to like for nostalgia? Do you actually use them? Like, are you turning to them for inspiration? Are you turning to them like, oh, I want to try that. Like, this is a recipe that sounds interesting to me and I remember it from childhood. I'm going to try it.
There are a few in there that I still use regularly, you know, because I think there are some dating back to even like the 50s in there. There are a lot of ingredients that we wouldn't necessarily use today. You know, a lot of lard.
Yeah.
A lot of lard on these recipe cards. But there are a few of them. Like there are these chocolate buttermilk pecan pralines. And it's a very simple recipe, but I still will make those. You know, like a very simple recipe for just like a blondie, just like a walnut blondie, but perfect. It still hits this many decades later. So why rock the boat? But quite a few of them, I would say it's the ingredients are the main thing. When you look at it, you're just kind of like, okay, maybe I wouldn't make this today, but I do love kind of the nostalgia piece of it. I'm holding this piece of paper that has traveled through my family through generations.
Because sort of where you ended up being when you sort of like embraced your hobby and turned it into profession is so creative. Were you a creative kid? Were you like an artist? Did you have art supplies that you're like around the house? Where did all of that come from?
I feel like I always wanted to be creative. I desperately wanted to be an artist. I loved taking, art classes in school, and I felt like I was never good at them. I felt like I was kind of just like waiting on the bleachers for whatever it was to get called up my specific path into an artistic field. It is hilarious. People ask all the time, like, oh, are you a painter? Or you could do this and this. And I'm just like, no, I don't know what it is. I don't know why it only comes out in the form of hyperrealistic cakes. But as far as other art forms go, I would love to be. I love, the concept of creativity and the arts and everything. My skill set seems to be very siloed into just making hyperrealistic cakes. I love an arts and crafts. I'm never great at them. Well, and that's why I ended up in grad school going into the career path that I did. I went into advertising because I desperately wanted a creative field, and I had this communications undergrad degree. And I thought I thought advertising was going to be what you see in the movies and this incredibly creative career, which ended up not being the case.
Yep.
But I'm so happy that I finally found where it was meant to be.
Your first cake decorating project, you saw a Christmas tree cake while you were in grad school and got inspired, but you'd only ever really made cake from a box prior to this time with your aforementioned pal. And I love that you thought it was going to be super easy to do, but I don't think would describe the process as easy. Tell us about that. Where did you stumble upon the cake and what should we picture?
So I'm almost positive it was a Good Housekeeping magazine. I need to see if I can find a way to go and track down the actual source. I have a photo of what the cake was supposed to look like in the magazine. I just don't have the actual issue. But coming through it, Christmas issue, and I see this Christmas tree cake. And it's like, imagine if you baked a sheet cake, or a 9x13, and you cut out cascading size squares. stacked them up in a tree shape and then decorated everything with green frosting and, put little buttons for ornaments and made pipes on some garland. And I can look at that now and say it's a simple cake design, but at the time, having never decorated a cake before, I had no business thinking that would be easy, but something in my brain was just like, well, it'll be really easy. And it was like a Tuesday night, like there was no event coming up. I just was like, oh, this will be my, what I'm doing with my free time tonight, because I would go home and bake every single day. I started and it turned so bad so quickly. But I was having so much fun doing it. Like I had so many friends when I would show them photos of it after the fact, they would just say, why did you finish? Why did you keep going? And I was like, are you kidding me? I had the most fun I've ever had baking up to this point. And the decorating piece of it just unlocked something in my brain. And it was like, oh my gosh, I love baking. And decorating is this artistic piece that I have been looking for, like the creativity piece I've been looking for in my life. I'm apparently very bad at it, but I want to be better. So I just went out and bought every single book on cake decorating that I could find. And that just became my new drive and focus moving forward.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that because you mentioned that there was no YouTube yet. So it's not like you could really watch videos of people making hyper-realistic cakes and be like, oh, wow. So which books were you buying?
The very first one I got is just Cake Decorating. That's the title of the book. If you look at the cover, it looks like it's straight out of the 80s. And this one is just, piping buttercream, like how to use the different tips, how to create different things. The first one that kind of opened up the realistic cake element of it, Elisa Strauss has this series of books. And the first one was called Confetti Cakes. And I'll never forget it. It had a purse on the cover that was a cake, like a beautiful brown purse.
Yeah.
And I saw that and I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, like that's exactly what I want to do. Like I want to learn how to do that. And I must have read that book cover to cover 10 different times. I would pick like a technique out of each different cake design. And, like every day, I think I was still in grad school, after school, just teach myself a new little technique. And then over time, just kind of pieced it together into a little education on how to decorate cakes.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. Are you looking for a little more cherry bomb in your life? Our annual magazine subscription is the perfect way to stay inspired all year long. You'll receive our beautiful new issues delivered right to your door with free shipping. Each issue is filled with thoughtful interviews, beautiful full-color photos, delicious recipes from the season's best cookbooks, and stories celebrating the women and creatives in the food and drink space. Subscriptions are $100 a year, and you can also gift one to the food lover in your life. Head to cherrybomb.com or click the link in our show notes to subscribe today. Now back to our guest. You kept on decorating through grad school, and then after grad school went to D.C. for your first post-school job, and were making cakes every night. At that point, were you making hyper-realistic cakes, or you were just baking?
Primarily still just baking, but definitely leveling up my baking. So, finding very intricate cake recipes, trying, pastry and things outside of cake. But I also was dabbling more and more with hyper-realistic cakes. At that point in time, I want to say this was maybe 2011-ish, around there. It was still pretty hard to get, the tools that you need for a hyper-realistic cake. DC didn't have one of the immaculate cake stores like New York has. You couldn't really source things off Amazon the way that you can now. And you also couldn't go to the store and buy a giant tub of fondant the way that you can now. So it was very hard to source the ingredients to make these cakes and the tools to create these cakes. So whenever I had the chance, I definitely would. Like I remember it was someone's birthday and they loved hippos were their favorite animals and they loved the color pink. So I made a pink hippopotamus and I was so proud of how it came out. And another one was like a Ravens football helmet for someone, in the DC area, their birthday. Yeah, just fun stuff like that. And I would play around with pie art for a little bit, cutting stuff out of the pie crust, decorating it, that sort of thing. But the pull was definitely towards cake. Yeah. So the more I was able to access tools and ingredients, the more I was starting to make them.
So you loved the cake making and the baking and the decorating so much, and you were thinking about going to culinary school, but too expensive. And so I love this. It sort of reminds me of my own path. But you made this deal or this arrangement with this bakery specializing in sort of like Americana baked goods, where you worked the 4 a.m. to 9 a.m. shift before going to your ad job. Did you scout out that particular bakery because you loved what they were doing? And then what made them hire you if you didn't have any experience? Like, how did you get in the door?
It is kind of crazy, right? Like, looking back on that and I were in her position, I don't know that I would have hired me. I would say kind of 3 main bakeries that I kind of had my eye on in DC at that time. 2 of them were in Georgetown, and both of them, I think, exclusively only did cupcakes. And this was the one when I was a kid and my mom and I would talk about like how cool it would be to work at a bakery one day, like that. It was the type of bakery that I envisioned, just the vintage colors and, red velvet cakes and chocolate chip cookies, that sort of thing. So that was definitely my number one choice. And, the location was great. It was walkable from my apartment. It wasn't like I would have to take the metro across town. It was definitely my first choice. I just went in one day and I asked if they were hiring. The woman who had started the bakery just happened to be there that day. And she was like, let's sit down and have a coffee real quick. She was like, okay, like, tell me about your experience, tell you what you're looking for. And I just kind of put it all on the table. I was like, I absolutely love baking. I feel like some path of this is what I'm meant to do with my life. I explained to her my financial situation, that I still had student loans from grad school, couldn't really afford to go to culinary school, but I just needed some real world experience to tell me if this calling I was having was real, or is this just a whim that I need to get out of my system and I can go back to working my 9-to-5 agency job. And she was telling me, she listened to everything I had to say and then told me that basically she had kind of had a similar crisis of conscience. She did end up going to culinary school, but she said, she felt like she was talking to herself across the table, like however many years prior. She was very upfront about like, I could have the lowest level, like being a prep cook basically in the kitchen for the morning shift. And I was like, really what I want out of this is just to learn absolutely everything I can, because there's so much that you learn from, working for someone else in that capacity, working in a commercial space versus doing it out of my own home kitchen, that you just, you don't know what you don't know. So I just told her I wanted to be a baking sponge and just learn every single thing that I could. And she was very receptive to that and really offered me a job that day. So
that's amazing.
It was amazing. I think I started the following Monday and it was the best. I mean, I made so little money, but I look back on that. It's just like one of the best experiences of my life.
Of course. Then you ended up moving to Charleston, which is where you're based now. You'd already dabbled a little bit in these hyper-realistic cakes. You started your weekend business for Heaven Bakes in 2016. So cute. What a cute name. Did you start with sort of making groom's cakes and birthday cakes?
I kind of accidentally fell into that. So I knew that I wanted to just make hyper-realistic cakes. In my dream scenario, if I'm starting my own business, I just want it to be hyper-realistic cakes. And at the very beginning, you're kind of like getting your footing. So I took on some other things like a cutesy little cartoony kid's birthday cake or some decorated sugar cookies. But once I started taking on orders, I noticed that a lot of them were for groom's cakes, which is such a huge tradition in the South. And Charleston is this absolute massive destination wedding location. So there is just no shortage of wedding business. And, I kind of started doing my research and I realized that none of the other bakeries in town focused on hyperrealistic cakes. There were a couple that they rarely did them. They had like one person on the staff that could do them. But I thought, what if I just went hard down that avenue and then just focused exclusively on groom's cakes? And so that's definitely, maybe after like the first 6 months of my business, kind of how I pivoted. And that was where the path led me from there, which ended up being fantastic from a business standpoint, because like I was saying, there were no shortage of weddings coming to Charleston. So that just kind of all fell into place, which then later opened the door for other types of events and working for other types of clients.
Tell us what a groom's cake is.
So a groom's cake is almost always a hyperrealistic cake. So a hyperrealistic cake is a cake that looks like a thing that is not a cake. In its simplest terms, a way to make the groom feel special, because Southern weddings are very very focused on the bride. I mean, they're focused on the couples, but a lot of the festivities are very, very focused around the bride. They traditionally were served at the rehearsal dinner. So, the rehearsal dinner is meant to be this kind of low-key celebration before the big celebration. Sometimes people have them at the wedding as well. So they have your beautiful tiered traditional wedding cake right next to, this cake of a cowboy boot or your dog or something fun like that. So I would say more weddings in Charleston have them than don't have them.
Oh, that's so interesting. Maybe around this time when you were in Charleston, a few years in, you started doing some of the hyper-realistic cake TV shows, like you were on Netflix's Is It Cake? I loved learning that sort of your takeaway from that, or the big perk for you personally, besides the fact that I think you're very close friends with some of the people that were on the shows, with, like it built your community, was also that you could raise your prices and not have people balk at you because it was like, oh my gosh, it's a cake from a TV lady.
100%. I think the first show I did, it filmed sometime during COVID. It was a Food Network one. I want to say like 2021 maybe is when that either filmed or aired. So I had established my business at that point. And that also kind of was right around the same time when I feel like hyper-realistic cakes seemingly overnight were all over social media. It was like people had seen them, but then overnight everyone was seeing videos of these being cut. It looks like an apple and you cut into it and it was a cake. So I started being, inundated with these requests, and you see a 4-second video of a cake being cut on Instagram and people just have no idea the price point of these cakes is so much higher than a regular cake just because of the time and materials involved in making them. So, people would reach out and be like, oh, I want a life-size cake of a bowl and I want it for $150.
Yeah.
You'd be like, you're like having to constantly justify why the cakes are so much more expensive. But yeah, then once I had the opportunity to start doing these baking competition shows, it was kind of like an added credibility bonus overnight that people, suddenly don't balk at the price anymore. And it's like, I'm still making the same cake I would have made you before, but I have this resume point that this person is now no longer pushing back on what the price. So I'm able to actually charge what it's worth.
That's so great. You're also, at least now, and maybe back then as well, teaching a lot of workshops, doing online classes, which has become something you realize you really love.
Yes. I mean, I love this career path for so many reasons, but it keeps taking me in new avenues that I didn't think were possible. I remember early on in Charleston, someone asking me if I would ever teach classes. And I thought, why would anyone want to take a class for me? Like, I wouldn't be a good teacher. After the shows started coming out, I took a couple opportunities to take them. It was the first time I had that feeling, the same feeling I had from decorating the Christmas tree cake. Like, it lit a spark inside of me that I didn't know was even missing. It's just such an immense joy that I get from teaching other people how to create these hyper-realistic cakes. And I just can't get enough of it. So I've had the opportunity to travel around and teach classes kind of all over, just all kinds of different hyper-realistic cake things.
So great.
It's so incredible.
Now we're going to talk about sort of when you build a cake. And I thought it would be fun to start with Reese Witherspoon's. You've done her birthday cakes, I think, 2 years in a row or at least twice.
Yeah, there were a couple years in between, but 2 separate years.
You did 2 bags for her. You did the Draper bag with like a pink champagne and strawberry flavored cake. And then you did this rattan bag with like magnolia flowers on it and these leather accents. Folks, you have to look online and Google these cakes or just go to Julie's Instagram and see them. They're so great. I love them. These cakes, and I'm sure this applies to all of them, can take anywhere from like 15 hours to 50 hours. It can be really intense. If somebody wants a realistic cake of a thing that they have, you ask for that thing and sort of begin by copying it and taking measurements. Is that what we should picture? Like, did Reese's people send you a copy of the bag that they wanted you to make a cake from?
Yes. So the Reese cake specifically, she has a clothing line, Draper Jeans, and she may have sold the brand since then. I'm not sure if she's still involved, but this was, early iteration of that. She was like, this was her company. It's, her family, all of that. So she was very, very involved. But for her birthday every year, they designed a specific handbag that was her birthday present. And so the 2 cakes that I made were the 2 like custom Reese birthday bags that they created for her. and they wanted life-size replicas, like perfect replicas of each of the two bags. So in those instances, exactly what you said, I almost always, if you're going for a perfect replica, you basically have to have the real object to start with. So the first one was this cute pink leather purse that had a pink and white gingham interior. So you get the bag and you just start taking every single measurement possible, on parchment paper, drawing templates. You trace the bottom of the cake, the side of the cake, the handle of the cake, the interior of the cake. You're using a fabric tape measure. Every single piece of this cake you want to measure, trace, and then you create just an absurd amount of templates first on parchment, then you cut them trace them onto cake boards and use an X-Acto knife, cut them out of cake boards as well. And then you just kind of use that as your starting point to start physically building this cake as well. And so the pink one, they wanted a fun cake flavor to go with it. So it was her birthday. So we did a pink champagne cake. I think it was a strawberry buttercream, a raspberry buttercream. I can't remember, but just so fun. So, just starting with a sheet cake, and then I take the little templates I've made and you just kind of place it on top of your sheet cake and carve out pieces, and then, cake layer buttercream, carve the whole thing, cover it in buttercream or ganache, and then you start covering it with the details, which is the most fun part, which really brings it to life.
How many sheet cakes to make Reese's pink cake? How many sheet cakes do you have to bake?
I think that was maybe 2 half sheets, and then that was definitely more cake than needed. The rattan one was bigger. I think it was maybe double the size. I want to say that one had maybe 6 layers all in, so that was probably another 2 half sheets, but didn't end up using all of them. The rattan one definitely had a lot of trial and error because the bag, it's this beautiful rattan bag with these magnolias that are embroidered on top of the rattan. And then there's a leather band around the top as well. I love the trial and error to try to get textures to look as realistic as possible. And whereas the pink bag was just a leather bag, so that was one texture, this one, had 3 or 4 different textures. So it was so much trial and error on my part to kind of figure it out to get everything to look exactly the way it did on the real bag.
And when you're doing your trial and error, do you start by building the cake and then you can always just stick that in the freezer or the refrigerator and then practice what the texture is going to be, what the decoration is going to be, and put that on something made of styrofoam to see if you like, or how does it work?
For something like the rattan where I had kind of 3 unknowns, I didn't know exactly how I was going to get each of these 3 textures. I am too much of an anxious person for a project of that scale to not know exactly what I'm going to do ahead of time. I would just take fondant and modeling chocolate and food coloring and paintbrushes and play around with just small pieces on a pastry mat. And then, try a few different things. And then once I figured out the technique I was going to use for each of them, then I would start building the cake from there.
You want to perfect what the design elements are going to be and how you're going to make them, but you're not necessarily perfecting them in a large scale. You're just perfecting them so that you have a little piece of the rattan and okay, I will do this on a much larger piece of fondant or malleable chocolate. Okay. Then you will go and make the cake. Once you know what you're doing, then you stick the cake in the refrigerator or the freezer while you make all the decorative parts. Like you say, it can be many day process. It's not like I woke up in the morning and made the cake, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Which is why the baking shows are so funny because people think that that's what it's like in the real world. And no, in the real world, we would all spend 2 to 3 days making these cakes. Usually day 1 is the baking day. So baking the cakes, making buttercream, making ganache. I'll usually start stacking and carving that day. And then you carve the cake and you get a base layer of ganache over it and then pop that into the fridge. So it's getting rock hard overnight. Then the next day is when I start kind of the first wave of the exterior decoration. And
people can pick their flavors. I noticed, I think it was the rattan one was funfetti cake. People can choose whatever flavor they want. You just mention that it's likely going to have a layer of ganache. And if someone goes, what? I hate ganache, then you don't do that. But that's sort of your go-to would be you pick the flavor of cake. I'll pick a buttercream that goes with that flavor, or you can tell me what that flavor should be, and then we'll put this ganache on top.
Right. I usually give people a flavor list and they can pick a combo of cake and frosting. And then I'll weigh in on if I think the cake design needs a ganache or not. So the groom's cake is a Guinness chocolate cake with a dark chocolate buttercream.
Yeah.
They pick it almost every single time. The event cakes, they tend to like it's either a pistachio cake with a varying buttercream or a vanilla cake with usually like a raspberry buttercream. Between those two, those are the most popular for events. And then for the brand cakes, I will say that one varies a lot because a lot of times with that, I'm developing a recipe for them.
Yep.
And it's something tied specifically to either a holiday, or something specific to their brand.
Yep. When you have the item and you can be looking at it and measuring it, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes you're asked to blow something up larger than the actual item. And you said that is tough because then it's all about math, and math is hard.
It gives me so much anxiety.
Yeah.
So much anxiety, Jessie, every time when they're like, we want this, but we want it large scale. Or, it's a large scale thing that we want small scale. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Let's just strap in for all of this math.
So I know that you spend a lot of time at Lowe's and Home Depot buying building materials for your cakes. Can you tell us, is it dowels and styrofoam and an like what things are you buying there?
It's almost always for the internal cake structure. I was actually there earlier this week because I am trying to get a custom cake stand built that I found out I will have to build myself. So that one's kind of a rarity, but it's almost always for the internal cake structure. That varies, but it's usually one or a combination of threaded rods, which have varying layers of cake boards that I'll attach in there. So you have, 8 locking washers up one threaded rod. Sometimes there's copper piping attached. Like if you were making a person with arms and you needed to create this armature, you've got this copper piping that you can bend, but is still really strong. Or PVC pipe is another one as well. It has fittings that you can attach so you can create a T shape or a Y shape or just a traditional L shape as well. And then I'll usually need kind of a custom wood base to start to build the cake off of. But without fail, every single time I'm in there, a polite gentleman comes over to ask me if I need help and asks what the home project I'm working on. And I say it's for a cake, and it's just a blank stare.
That's hilarious.
And I know, but let's just get past the point that I said it's a cake and let's just focus. If you can help me find the thing that I need.
Right.
But it's too funny.
So with all that internal scaffolding, as it were, does that mean when you cut into the cake, you bang into the washer? Or if it's arms, you can't cut off an arm and eat it?
I should say every cake in general, I give a cutting guide with. So it's got an illustration of the cake. And if there is internal hardware, it kind of has ironed out what is what and where it's at. So they know where to cut. And other times the cutting guide is just cut wherever. There's no internal hardware. I did a fish a couple weeks ago and they were like, okay, where's the structure? And I was like, go nuts. You're good. There's no structure in this one.
I wanted to ask about working with the fondant, which I actually have never done. And I noticed in some of your reels where you're sort of showing particularly the building of one of the Reese cakes, there's a big silicone mat from, I think it's OXO brand, on your work surface that you're are you rolling fondant out on that?
I use that same mat for modeling chocolate and for fondant. And
tell us what the difference is, because I don't think I know. What is modeling chocolate?
Modeling chocolate is essentially just made from the chocolate wafers. And if you melted it down with corn syrup and then kind of massaged it into a ball and let it set up, it becomes very close to a clay consistency. Mm-hmm. And with modeling chocolate, you can just add so much more detail to. So that's why it's a very popular thing, probably more so than fondant and hyperrealistic cakes, especially on the food cakes. Creating little intricate details and whatnot. Whereas fondant, which has a marshmallow base, that's what you envision when you picture roll out a huge piece of fondant and put it over your smooth tiered wedding cake. Mm-hmm. So something like a purse cake that has smooth sides, fondant would be great for that. Because if you had modeling chocolate, every little ding of my finger putting it into place, you would just have a ton of fingerprints in there. Whereas fondant, it would be perfectly smooth. It dries harder. Modeling chocolate, is still kind of always a little bit pliable because it has the chocolate element to it. So two totally different things, but you can just do so much with them. And a lot of cakes end up having a combination of both in some capacity.
And the modeling chocolate, did you say chocolate wafers? Meaning circular flat pieces discs of chocolate? For one second, I thought you meant Nabisco chocolate wafers. And I was like, really? So it's the chocolate discs. And what was the other ingredient you said?
Corn syrup. If you were going to make your own, you can buy it pre-made.
Do you buy it?
It depends. Modeling chocolate has some unbelievable pre-made versions that use incredibly good quality chocolate, but it's very expensive. So if I have to have a ton of it, I will make my own because it's just not cost effective to buy it. But if it's a small amount, and they also make brands that hold up really well to heat, which being in a place like Charleston in the summer with humidity, it just holds up so much better than anything I would make out of my own kitchen.
Is there a white chocolate version so you can use it even if your cake is not brown?
Yes, so they almost always come as the white chocolate version.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
You can buy them in colors, but I think only the brown one is the one that uses like true chocolate. Everything else is like a white chocolate base.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Mm-hmm. I'll color it myself. So with hyperrealistic cakes, coloring I feel like that could be a class in and of itself, just especially if it's a perfect replica of something. Because, like with buttercream too, it's kind of the same way. When you add food coloring to something, it looks different after it sets up. But kind of going back to my trial and error with the Reese bag for the different textures, I had to try different colorings on the different elements to see how they would look after setting up for 8 hours.
Yep.
So when I was doing all my little testers, coloring was a piece of that as well. But to color modeling chocolate, it's the same way you would color fondant as well. You kind of mold it for a second on your pastry mat to heat it up a little bit, make it more pliable in your hands. And then you use gel food coloring a little bit at a time. You absolutely should wear rubber gloves because food coloring stains are so hard to get out. And then you just knead it like you're kneading a piece of dough, like if you're working on a loaf of bread. And it definitely takes some time, takes a lot of arm muscle. And it would be way easier to just buy pre-colored fondant, but very rarely do I need, just red or just yellow. It's usually like a very specific color of something.
Yeah, I saw you doing that in your videos. I saw the gloves, and then I also saw, I didn't know what it was, but it could have been fondant, it could have been the modeling chocolate, but you had sort of almost like a kneaded piece of something that you just put a few drops of gel on it, and then you kind of kneaded it together until it came to the color you wanted it to be. So that must be another really annoying trial and error piece of this. You might have it set up for 8 hours and realize it's the wrong color.
Yes, which is why, so going back to I very rarely would start a cake without knowing exactly what I was going to do ahead of time. And when people are like, I just don't understand why these cakes take so much time. And it's because there's so much prep work involved before you can even start making the cake, just to make sure that it comes out the way that you want it.
So when you're doing this, you have to take copious notes. Because if you write down 3 drops of food coloring and you meant 2, you're totally screwed when you make it for the cake because you're not putting in enough.
Yes. And let me tell you, you will make that mistake once and then never again when you're like, oh, I'll remember it. And then you start doing it and you're like, wait a minute, what?
Yeah, how many drops? That's intense.
So if it's something that has to be an exact match to a product I've been given, I'll usually set out a piece of parchment, do just kind of like a $50 sized amount of each of the things. And I write out on the parchment, like how many drops, like what the combination was. And I'll do that on my prep day or my research day. And then the next day I come and look and hold everything up. And it's also really important to look at it like in different lighting, like daylight versus middle of the night kitchen lighting. But yeah, it's copious notes for sure.
When you're rolling out the fondant or the modeling chocolate, is there cornstarch? Are you rolling it out in corn? Like, is there some powdery something or other? What are you using when you're rolling out?
I'll usually use cornstarch. You could use powdered sugar too, but I would usually just do that for if I were working with fondant. But cornstarch, keeps it from getting sticky. And especially with modeling chocolate, it's not really going to dry it out. Sometimes if it's a huge piece of fondant, cornstarch could end up drying it out a little bit more. So you just kind of have to be careful. But yeah, the pastry mats, the ones you were talking about, I live by those for so many reasons. I mean, one, it's so easy to peel modeling chocolate and fondant off of those. But 2, mine have the built-in rulers around the top and sides, which is a must with basically any hyper-realistic cake. I love those mats. I recommend them to everyone. In all the classes I teach, like those are the mats we use as well. I'm like, you guys are going to use them.
Yeah, I use them all the time because if I'm kneading dough or making biscuits or anything where you're dumping something out on your work surface, I use them because I'm a neat freak and they just contain your mess. And then you just have to
Yes.
wash that, and your counter isn't covered in flour and little bits of dough. And then I also use them when I roll out pie dough, because I'm like, I don't have like an artist's eye. I can't tell. This is 9 inches. I need to like see, like, is it fitting in the 12-inch circle?
And also with food coloring, when you're putting food coloring and kneading it in modeling chocolate and fondant, if you do it on the mat, then you don't stain your countertop.
100%.
So,
Was that something you learned from a fellow hyper-realistic cake decorator, or is that just something that you ended up sort of being like, this is really working for me, I'm going to keep going?
I honestly don't remember. That's such a great question. The very first time I ended up using one, it was probably suggested in like a tools list of one of those very first books that I had gotten about cake decorating. Then that became my, okay, anytime I'm decorating a cake, I have this mat out, and then that's kind of my catch-all. And then once I started meeting more people in the industry, it was like, oh, everyone does that too. That's fun, but I was doing something right.
One other thing I noticed in the videos, which I assume these kinds of products are maybe coming from specialty cake stores that are either in Charleston or you're ordering stuff online, but lots of small knives that you're using to cut out. Like you said, you're going to use them to cut out, after you do your parchment template, the bottom of Reese's bag. And then you have that shape. And then when you cut your cake, it has to be that shape. What are those little like X-Acto knives?
It's a retractable X-Acto knife. If I were going to give someone a cake decorating toolbox, that would probably be the first tool I would put in there.
Yeah.
Because especially when you're working with both hands and you have one hand on something and you're cutting out with the other, using that retractable blade, you could just so quickly like trace it and pop the blade back in. Those things are incredible. I use them all the time. I think I have a stash of 15 of them that I just rotate through. They're the absolute best.
So the toolkit would have the retractable X-Acto knife. It would also have the mat. What else would it have? I assume lots of food coloring. What's your favorite brand? Is there like a gel food coloring that you love? Or do you use gel?
I do use gel. It kind of ebbs and flows. So there are two brands that I use most often. So one is Americolor. And Americolor makes a really good gel, like highly concentrated, but it's easily accessible. Like you can get it on Amazon. A lot of cake decorating stores will sell it. And they also make a really good airbrush food color. So for airbrushing cakes as well. And then another brand is called Color Mill. And I think they're made out of Australia. And I'll give the caveat that it's been a little more difficult to get once, all the tariff business kind of started.
Yeah.
So I don't know where we netted out on that. They're these unbelievable concentrated colors, and they make a specific set, one that are gels, but then two, they created them specifically for chocolate products.
Oh.
And then a specific buttercream product as well, like a food coloring just made for buttercream. Like it just works really well with fats. I mean, they're unbelievable. They're pricier, but they're just, oh my gosh, they're the absolute best.
Matching the color is such a big part of your job. And if you're already working with a really great product with a lot of variety, you're already like ahead of the game.
100%.
Yeah.
Definitely put those food colorings. Another tool I would put in there would be, it's called a Dresden tool. And I don't know if you would know what that is. It's very common for making sugar flowers. It basically looks like a two hooked end little pencil that you would have. And one has kind of a rounded flat side, and then the other is literally just kind of like a pointed hook. But it primarily for sugar flowers, but I have yet to make a hyper-realistic cake that I didn't also use this tool in as well.
I did want to talk just briefly about both the groom cakes and a specific sort of intricate cake that you did for an event, which are these citrus topiary cakes, which are shaped kind of like a pyramid or a big triangle. And then with all of these oranges hanging off of it. Tell us about how that cake came to be. And then each orange is its own cake.
Yes.
Yeah, and then it's a cake made of cakes, and then is the actual sort of tree or topiary, is that just structural, or is that something you're eating?
So the internal structure of that tree was actually a giant Rice Krispie treat. So like shaped in a cone. So the whole thing was edible. There was no structure in the cake. It was like a women's retreat that was happening. And I can't remember, the theme I was given was, something about fresh start or something. There was like a citrus tie into the theme. These citrus topiaries are very common in the South. Like on a lot of holiday and event tablescapes, you will see them kind of down the fancy dining room table or cocktail parties. I had like a bucket list of cakes, and that one had been on there for a while. And I was like, oh my gosh, finally the perfect opportunity has presented itself. They wanted an event where people could kind of interact with the cake, but also it be a focal point as well. And so it was literally a cake made of cakes, a row of oranges, a row of lemons, and do that cascading all the way up to the top. And each one was an individual cake. So the oranges were individual orange cakes and the lemons were individual lemon cakes. So people could just kind of come up and pick one off and then go from there. There was no structure, but each one kind of had a toothpick coming out of the Rice Krispie treat to help stick the fruit on there. So that was they weren't just kind of crushing down on themselves.
Tell us about a groom's cake. I know he was once your groom, but now he's your husband. But I know that you always make him a really special birthday cake. Mm-hmm. And he loved cantaloupe one year. And so you surprised him with a cantaloupe cake that was just next to a cantaloupe on the counter.
Yes. His birthday cakes. So my husband, Kyle, his birthday cakes it's my favorite cake to make every single year. We're in the same house with the same kitchen. So it's always I make him announce himself when he's coming by the kitchen, and then I'll have to cover the workstation and everything while I'm working on it. And then I get to do the big reveal on his birthday. But there have been some good ones. He's a huge baseball fan and a huge fisherman. So that lends itself to a lot of cakes within there. I think I made a Lord of the Rings Hobbit house one year because he loves the Lord of the Rings movies. There have been so many.
And is there a favorite groom's cake? Seafood boil or a lobster boil or oysters? Do those tend to be groom's cakes? I think I saw one which is maybe a baseball hat for a golfer. Is there a special groom's one that you want to just describe for us?
The groom's cakes are almost always a version of their pet, a version of a sport, or a version of their favorite food. And so the food ones, I love a food cake. A food hyperrealistic cake, I think everyone just loves. And a lot of times people will pick very Charleston-centric things. So a low country boil or an oyster roast. And those are just, oh my gosh, I just have so much fun with those. The oyster ones in particular, oysters, that's a huge industry in Charleston. So you can actually go to the oyster shell recycling centers and they will just give you a bunch of shells. And then I use those to mirror the real, I model each individual chocolate shell after a real one. And I just think that's such a fun, what a cool thing that you get to eat and then get to have to talk about your wedding as well.
Do you make them out of the modeling chocolate?
I do either modeling chocolate, or if you make a mold of them, you could do a poured melting chocolate. But I tend to sway the modeling chocolate route because then you can craft them to look exactly how you want and really kind of make them your own. Whereas, if you do a mold, they'll kind of all start to look the same, which isn't what a real tray of oysters would look like. You want, no two oysters look the same.
There's some videos of you sort of teaching your oyster classes because people love those. Mm-hmm. And then you could see everybody sort of painting their oyster. But those oysters they were painting were chocolate oysters, correct? Yeah.
Right. And they were painting them with food coloring. And that is, of all the classes I teach, I think I teach that one the most often. And it is so much fun. It's so Charleston, and it's usually people that have never, they've never even decorated a cupcake in their entire life. And they're like, oh, I'm not going to be able to do this. And I'm like, it's not about that. It's just about kind of making it your own. Yeah. And people just get such a kick out of it. And again, the joy I get from seeing people's faces light up when they see what they've created at the end of the class, I just can't get enough of that.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, Julie. And I just want to say that you are my cherry pie.
Oh, thank you so much, Jessie. Such a delight to get to spend the afternoon with you.
That's it for today's show. Don't forget to follow She's My Cherry Pie on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And tell your pals about us. She's My Cherry Pie is a production of the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. Our producers are Carrie Diamond, Catherine Baker, and Jenna Sadu. Thank you so much for listening to She's My Cherry Pie. And happy baking!